Sherry finally had hope, and as she told her mother about the news that Tom and Marcus had come across some evidence and were now looking into it. For once her daughter, her mom and Sherry had hope. But her mom pleaded with Sherry that she not get her hopes too high. They had hopes before and nothing had ever come of it. But, this time the police had initiated the re-investigation and Perry was now working along with the Paul Drake Detective Agency. If they couldn't find out what happened, no one would. She was afraid she was running all of the memories for the 100th time when the phone rang. She looked at the caller ID. It was Paul Drake. Sherry took a nervous deep breath and picked up the phone. The man on the phone sounded pleasant and he agreed to meet with her and her daughter and mom that evening. He assured her that his agency was going to do everything they could to bring justice into her home. As soon as she had any information, she would call her father-in-law Joe and let him know what was going on. He was so hurt when Ralph had died and Mary had gone to the grave not knowing what had happened to her son. Paul hung up his phone and headed out to meet with Walter Hawks. He lived only about a mile from Sue and John. He had tried to get hold of Millie, but he had gotten her answering machine. Walter lived in senior housing and his apartment number was plainly marked. Paul got out of the car and walked up the walkway. He was greeted by an elderly gentleman who was using a walker to get around. Being a private eye for almost 5 years and helping out at the office since he had been a child, Paul had a sort of sixth sense about people. Something about Walter did not set well with him. Although Walter appeared to be friendly, something about his movements or expressions were indicating to Paul that he knew something that he didn't want Paul or anyone else to know. As an investigator, though, it was his job to get Walter's confidence and find out what he was trying to keep from him. Walter took a seat across from Paul and asked him, "What can I do to help?" He was watching the young man with interest. This Ralph Walden murder had caused a deep wound to many of the people in town and he wished that it would just go away. But, now after all this time the case was being reopened and the big city lawyer and his private detective agency was going to digging into things that would better be left buried. Ralph was at peace now, he was sure. Sherry and her daughter had lived a good life and it was time to let it go. He thought. Paul gave the man his most congenial smile and spoke. "I have information that on the evening of the night before Ralph Walden was murdered you witnessed an altercation between Ralph and Fred Field. Can you tell me something about that conversation?" Walter smiled at this. "What conversation?" "The two guys were on the floor punching each other, rolling around like children." He laughed. "I pulled them apart, they shook hands and we headed to the local bar together as we had originally planned." Paul was taking notes and asked him, "What time did you arrive at the bar? Do you remember? Do you remember what time you left?" "We left right after work around 5 that evening. I don't know what time Ralph left because I left around 8. I had to go to a meeting that evening." "Who went with you to the bar?" Paul asked him. "Oh, there was me, Joe Drew, his wife was the bartender, Fred, Chris Martin, Dave Johnson, and then a whole bar full of patrons. It was very busy that night as most of us had just gotten paid." "Did anyone have a conversation with Ralph that evening? Did he have any words with anyone but you?" Paul asked him. Paul was sure that Walter was holding something back and he wanted to press the issue. Walter found himself fidgeting in his chair. There were so many people there that night, including one of the selectmen who had been running his mouth about some kind of donation he had just received to help him get re-elected. Oh, what the heck. So at this point he decided to let the young detective about the information. The selectman had been a pain in the neck for years and now he too lived in the same housing that he did. Paul had been patiently waiting for Walter to say something and smiled when Walter began to speak again. This time he was going to find some more information and he would be interviewing someone new to talk to. Walter smiled and said, "Yes, there was someone else there that night. He had a lot of power at the time and had long been after Sherry. He thought that Ralph was not good enough for her and he had been trying to get her to go out with him even though he and she were both married." Paul looked up from his notebook and asked him, "Do you know where the gentleman is now?" "Yeah, I know, he lives 2 doors down. His name Lee Crozier. He doesn't speak to me much because he thinks that he is better than I am. But, he lives here just like I do." It was then that Paul thanked the man and walked down the hallway. Indeed, there was the door with the name Lee Crozier on the door handle. Paul knocked and heard someone coming to the door. Paul could see that the man was looking through the peephole, and he thought for a moment that the man on the other side of the door wasn't going to answer it. Lee Crozier looked out the peephole and immediately knew who was on the other side of the door. Word had gotten around that the famous Drake Detective Agency was in town. Great, just what he needed. He was retired and had nothing to do with that murder, but he was sure that Walter had run his mouth about him. Oh well, and with that thought he opened the door. Paul was welcomed into the cluttered room. The guy had to move things off the chair so that Paul could take a seat. He smiled and took a seat himself. It was then that Lee spoke. I am sure that you have spoken to Walter. He is what if he was a woman would be called a drama queen. Sherry was a pretty girl, and I never thought that she deserved the type of life she had with Ralph. Ralph could be very mean at times, and word was that he had hit her more than once. I just wanted to have some young love. Because my kids, I wouldn't leave my unhappy marriage. Paul was not going to be controlled by this man. He knew that this was a rehearsed speech, not a casual conversation, so he pressed the man. Did you and Ralph ever have words about this? With this Lee sneered. Of course we did. My wife Maggie at the time was hopping mad at me too. I took the $10,000 that I got from that stupid factory deal and I gave it to Sherry. I thought that she didn't deserve to have to pay for the funeral with a baby and all. She has never found out that it was me that paid for the funeral and too would like to keep it that way. Paul left the apartment and checked his messages. Millie had returned his call and would be home for the rest of the day.